I wanted to use the first few minutes to share my own expertise. I'm a historian. I've written mostly about American women's history, but I know a little bit about British history. So I wanted to talk just to set a context for what we're reading in Old Curiosity Shop about what historians have been finding out about the precarious nature of childhood in this period. And I guess we could start screen sharing.
Can you see that okay?
Yep.
Perfect.
Okay, I want to begin by talking about this book. I say childhood was precarious for two reasons. The infant and child mortality rate was horrific, and there was abuse of children. I looked up in 1840, just before this book was written, the average life expectancy in England was 40. And that doesn't mean that people routinely died around 40. It means that the number was brought down because infant and child mortality was so high, and that depressed the average. So there were so many childhood diseases. Germ theory wasn't well understood. Doctors could carry a germ from one child bed to another. There were no antibiotics. Sometimes drinking water wasn't safe. All these things children were very vulnerable to. And then there was actual abuse. And this is George Belmer is somebody I went to Stanford Graduate School with. His field was modern British history. And you see the title of his book. This was his dissertation. It came out in 1982. We started the program together. We walked down the aisle hand in hand, getting our PhDs. So a good friend whom we lost last year. I have not actually read the book, but I heard him give a presentation about the book some years ago. And my daughter and I went together. She was a history major. And George detailed the terrible treatment of children in so many ways. I wanted you to see that there is, it's not going to be airport read, but I'm sure it's at university libraries. He documents, as it says, child abuse. And at the end of his presentation, my daughter turned to me and she said, Dickens was a realist. Dickens did not exaggerate. And so, the hair-raising things that you read about in Charles Dickens, as in David Copperfield, as well as in this book and others, Nicholas Nickleby, this is not just grim fantasy. This is the kind of vulnerability that children, in fact, did have. Next slide. And I wanted to show you this. Other than the fate of little Nell, the most famous literary death of a child in the 19th century was undoubtedly Uncle Tom's Cabin, Little Eva. And I thought this was interesting. I Googled Death of Little Eva, and this is from the Victoria and Albert Museum. Uncle Tom's Cabin was published in 1852, translated into many languages. If any of you have seen Anna and the King of Siam, that's not what's the title of the movie? With
The King and I.
The King and I, yes. There's a little segment in that movie where the children dance a reenactment of Uncle Tom's Cabin. And in one edition that I read of Uncle Tom's Cabin, I got from the Berkeley Library, there was a letter from a princess in Siam, as it then was, saying, I've freed my slaves after reading your novel. So this novel, as did Charles Dickens' novels, it traveled all over the world. And the most potent emotional scene was the death of Little Eva. Next slide. I thought I would include this because this is a real world example of a very tragic death. When the Lincolns were in the White House, they had 4 sons. Eddie died before they got to the White House. Willie died in 1862, and his death just nearly broke his parents' heart. The 3rd son, Tad, survived Abraham Lincoln, but he did not live to adulthood. So of their 4 sons, only 1 lived to adulthood. So if you wonder why there are these powerful death of children scenes in 19th century literature, there are other literary examples and there are real world counterparts. So tragic. I just want to say also that in the 19th century, norms of marriage and family life were, patriarchy was beginning to be eroded on both sides of the Atlantic. You can see that in the Romantic movement. Emphasis on feeling, more companionate norms in marriage, and therefore a great emotional investment in one's children. And so in the 19th century, you have this intensity of feeling for children and this great vulnerability. And I think that helps give a context for the emotional resonance of the precarious nature of children. Does anybody have any questions or comments on anything I've said so far? Speak up. And has John arrived yet? I want to give him a chance to weigh in before I move on.
John is not here yet. I believe Caitlin wanted to speak, or Caitlin Cruhan.
Oh, please.
Himself.
I think this example of Willie Lincoln Glenna exemplifies the fact that it wasn't just a matter of poverty, that children and infants died, all too readily, but diseases were not well known and people with great resources couldn't save them. So it's just, I'm always struck when a royal family, and here in California, of course, the Stanford's young boy died of, I've forgotten. I know A.P. Giannini lost a child through hemophilia, but even very wealthy people, suffered these same losses.
Even as recently as the 1920s, Calvin Coolidge, President of the United States, lost his son, a young man who, I think he was playing tennis, but he got a blister on his foot that became infected. And it was before antibiotics, and he died. So again, I just think it really makes me angry about any cynicism about literary expressions of this theme, because there was so much real world suffering. I think I see David's hand up.
The one that always sticks in my mind is in Boswell's Life of Johnson. Boswell and Johnson are talking together, and Johnson says that his friend Hester Thrale, who was the wife of a very wealthy brewer, was fortunate. 4 of her 12 children had lived.
Oh my gosh.
The other thing I will say is that there are an immense number of 19th century British novels that talk about sanitary reform. One of the ones by my particular author, the heroine marries a guy whose wife and most of his children have died, and her major effort is to drain a pond that is next to his house. The water supply and so on became of overwhelming concern. And one of the things you ask people who were purchasing a house. Are the drains all right?
Yeah. Some years ago at the Universe, we got a wonderful lecture about cleaning up the Thames in this period. And I see Kathy's hand is up.
I was just going to say, we may be moving back to the Victorian era. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, we might be moving back to the Victorian era with the now head of the entire health department, when we're facing unpasteurized milk and people that the possibility of all the resources that have been put together over the last 200 years, or at least 100 years, with inoculating children, against childhood diseases, et cetera, et cetera.
Well,
So,
that's a large subject,
well, it may
which-
happen.
which we can't go into in great depth today, but I hear you. Well, I want then next, I just want to summarize the three parts in this novel before we go on and talk about the first part. The first chapters see Nell and Grandpa on the road, and we, again, the whole precarious nature of what's going on, all the different challenges. In some ways, I'm sure this is hardly an original thought, but it does seem like a bit of an odyssey, where, not Odysseus, but these two, the old man and the child, meet all these tests. Then after that portion, which ends kind of on an up note with the schoolmasters riding to the rescue. And then the next segment deals with the ogre Quilp, who hates everyone. And we see him in all his grotesquerie. And then the last segment deals with Nell and Grandpa again, and they have found a refuge. And so now I'd like to screen share again. Oh, I see. Hello, John. Did you have any announcements or anything you wanted to say?
No, I'm still having Wi-Fi problems, and so I'm on my phone. I can hear, but I can't see everyone. So no announcements. Carry on. I'm sure you're doing a fine job. Thank you, Glenna.
All righty. So I want to begin by looking at the next slide. Yeah, and before we go into detail about this segment, I wanted to bring up, I have no idea. I'm glad John is here. John, do you know if Dickens ever read Fanny Burney?
Not that I know of. He read 18th century novels, but mostly the male ones: Fielding, Smollett, Goldsmith. I don't recall any mention of Fanny Burney.
Well, this novel is, to my knowledge, and I'm not a PhD in literature, so if somebody knows to the contrary, I don't know of an earlier novel in which a woman is wandering around England the way she is in this novel. And let me just, I haven't reread it. I read it about 25 years ago, and I was so taken with it that I reread it almost immediately. And let me just summarize. It's set in the 1790s. It's set during the Terror, and the protagonist, the heroine, who's the wanderer, lands, she's escaped from the Terror. She lands in a boat from France, and she proceeds to go down in the social scale, and she encounters working class women. And so this is, to my knowledge, an early, if not the first, novel in which a woman who is defenseless, except for her own wits, wanders around the country by herself. And David, I see your hand up.
I know that there were a lot of female authors who've come back into the daylight in recent years. Fanny Burney was one who was admired by Jane Austen. I don't think Dickens ever got it with Austen. But one that I've not read that might precede this would be The Female Quixote. And I've forgotten the author's name.
Well, I was telling Ava about this. I read one novel by Fanny Burney, who was a contemporary of Jane Austen's, and I was so taken with it that I read two more. I
Good.
thought they were very proto-feminist. I read, the first one I read was Cecilia, and that
Yeah.
is, the premise is a young woman of some property, and she's, of marriageable age, but the issue is that her inheritance is contingent on her finding a man who will take her surname rather than her taking his. And then I read Evelina and then this one, but this one I found the most interesting. And again, I just want to, I don't want to go into great detail here, but just to make the point that Nell and her grandpa are not the first, wanderers. Nell is not the first female protagonist to be a wanderer. Next slide. I wanted to use this one. This is at the very beginning of the segment that we read, and it struck me because it has such a fairy tale quality. The grandpa is being, preyed upon by the card sharps, and Nell is a inadvertent witness, and she realizes that grandpa is going to steal from somebody, Mrs. Jarley, that has been nothing but kind to them. And so she has to make this desperate leap into the unknown of embarking on this journey. And I think that the illustration has such a fairy tale quality about it. The things going on in the far distance and so on. And I'm interested in other people's reaction to this image and to when you realize that Nell has to set off on this perilous journey.
Glenna, can you hear me? It's John.
Yes, yes.
I have a comment about this illustration. I'm glad you chose it because, and it has less to do with the content of the image. I think you're correct that there's a fairy tale quality about it, but the structure, the form of this illustration is unusual. It's unusual because if you compare it to the text that describes this scene, it's clear that everything that is seen by Nell, but Nell is not in the picture. Nell is outside the image, observing it. So the structure of the image is that it is focalized, it is seen from the perspective of Nell. Although in many illustrations in Curiosity Shop, Nell is inside the picture. But this shows us that Nell is an outside observer looking into a scene. Although we have to infer her presence. And it's an unusual structure. I think it's the first time in a Phys illustration that the outside observer is absent from the scene. And
Is it fair to also say that there's almost a subtle reference to the fact that this all starts with Master Humphrey's clock and a narration, and this is kind of evoking that this is a picture, not, how should I put it? It's a picture of a picture, not just a picture.
it's an image as perceived by Nell.
Right.
So one related structure that exists in many of the illustrations is that Quilp is looking in from the outside. Often his head appears through a window on the side, and the scene that he sees is the main content of the image. But in those pictures where Quilp is peering in through a window, he is visible as an onlooker, as an outside onlooker. But in this image, there's no window, there's no presence of Nell to indicate that she is there watching the scene that we see.
Right.
So structurally, it's a variation and an innovation that I think is important in later novels where Fizz and Dickens want to use the presence of an outside but not represented figure in the novel.
Barbara, you have your hand up?
Yes, this presents to me kind of a conflict that I noticed in this section that we read, which is a conflict about romanticism. To the romantic, the countryside. Nell is interested in getting out away from all the evils of city life. And we certainly have several chapters where we have the horrors of the Industrial Revolution. But here we are out in the countryside, and this is not, these are not nice guys, So throughout this whole section, I felt there was this sort of strange conflict with some of the ideas of the Romantic period.
Very good. And I see, Mary, you have your hand up?
I have a problem with the Fizz illustrations in their depiction of Nell. At times she seems like a little girl, and at other times she seems like a budding young woman. Do we know how old she is at the beginning of the journey with the grandfather, and about how old she is when she's in the, with the schoolmaster at the church?
Isn't she 13?
Yes.
Okay, all right. Okay, I guess that answers my question.
So then after they set off, the next chapter has them on a boat and meeting reasonable kindness, but they have no idea of where they're going to go or how they're going to survive. And then chapter 44, I wanted to use an image and a quote. Let's start with the picture on page 336. So this is a chapter where they're taken in by this man who works in a steel mill, and he has nothing really to offer except a floor to sleep on and some warmth. And again, it's interesting that Nell, I think your point about Nell and how sometimes the images are a little hard to completely fathom. She looks like the depiction of a very middle-class child. She's, even though she's not well garbed, her face and hair and so on are depicted as very soigné, actually, for wandering around the countryside. But their benefactor is just a picture of misery. It's hard to imagine how anybody could look much more miserable. He's ragged, his hair is disheveled, he's scrawny. And then next slide, and then we go to this quote. When he's talking about the fire in his mill. By the way, before we look at this quote, I want to tell you, when I was in high school, our girls' high Y took a field trip to a steel mill in Fontana in Southern California. And it's an image I will never forget. We were there at night, but it was working around the clock, apparently, or at least swing shift. And so we saw the molten steel being poured. And it's, it's an image that is almost literally seared in my memory. So when I read about the steel mill, it brought back that image to me. Is there anyone who would volunteer to, oh, and Wayne, I see you have your hand up. Go ahead and then we'll talk about this passage.
Okay, I'm unmuted, I guess. Well, I just wanted to make a quick comment about the barge men before we move on to the steel mill, because Dickens is so wonderful at giving us history. The barge men are really a pre-industrial kind of labor. They take a break and go and get drunk, come back, and then they go on to their destination at Birmingham. And this kind of thing, of course, greatly offended the evangelicals and would be stopped as whenever they could possibly do it. But when we get to Birmingham and the keeper of the fire and the steel mill, we are definitely in the industrial age. And it just fascinates me how Dickens, between these two episodes, can show us this transition from the older to the newer kind of labor. So in pure narrative form. That's all.
A wonderful point. That's a great point. It hadn't struck me quite that way, but of course you're absolutely right. So is anybody going to volunteer to read this passage out loud?
Glenna, I will read it. This is John again. Sorry, I'm not visible. But I wanted to piggyback on Wayne's comment and say that one of the things that this novel emphasizes again and again is that grandfather and Nell are walking across England, but occasionally they get a ride, and it's a great relief for the most part when someone picks them up and takes them in a wagon. And there's a wonderful scene or a passage later in this section of the novel that describes a delicious journey in a wagon. But the barge is a little bit different because these men are dangerous, or Nell perceives them as dangerous. It's not a comfortable ride. They do get drunk. I worry that Nell is going to be molested. They don't molest her because that would be too much to, the grandfather scene that we discussed before is as close as that ever comes in this novel. But they do force Nell to sing. And the singing that she does is not happy singing, it's singing on command. And so they are taking advantage of her. So it's different from the comfortable travel that she occasionally gets. even though it relieves her of the necessity of walking. So that's just another small point about travel in this novel. I think as this section goes on, there's more attention to Nell's feet. Nell's feet hurt. This is a novel about walking, and the grandfather even notices her feet. So anyway, I'll read the passage for you. It's like a book to me, the only book I ever learned to read, and many an old story it tells me. It's music, for it should know its voice among a thousand, for I should know its voice among a thousand, and there are other voices in its roar. It has its pictures too. You don't know how many strange faces and different scenes I trace in the red hot coals. It's my memory, that fire, and shows me all my life.
Thank you. I think this is just an extraordinary passage myself. And Peter, I'll call on you in just a minute. To me, it's one of the key passages that I've come across in the novel, because it's about the power of narrative. It's about, at least for me, it's about how somebody who's got this virtually unendurable life makes sense of it by putting it together as a story. And I think, I years ago, I used to attend, not because I had any alcoholics in my family, but I'm happy to say other problems, but not that. But I'd go to adult children of alcoholic meetings with a friend. And the theme was, if you can tell us every person's life has a story that's worth telling. And that was part of the therapy. And I've never forgotten that, and here you have this man who's, from the picture, so downtrodden, but he's making his life bearable with narrative. And so Peter.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Well, I was struck by when I read this by normally in a realist novel you would expect the poor to be illiterate and also almost like unable to like construct narratives because they don't have the mental capacity. But I think Dickens wants to have him be illiterate, but he doesn't want him to be absent of any imagination. He's a very sympathetic character, it's like he helps people. He actually gives her a penny. It's one of the cases that like at one point he's in the novel, he says, sometimes the poor are the most charitable people, so we feel he's the most downtrodden character, but Dickens feels like compelled to give him an imagination and to also to flesh him out as a sort of sympathetic character. So he can't read. But he's got this sort of fire as a substitute for his literacy. And he's got an imagination. He's not completely, he's not mentally degraded, unlike Quilp, who's like just a character. This guy has actually got some humanity and some substance to him,
And doesn't this passage have doesn't what you say have wonderful biblical echoes in The Widow's Mite? Because, the steel mill worker giving a penny is the widow's mite. Barbara.
What Peter just said, it goes back to this conflict that I was talking about earlier. But what I wanted to mention just off track is there's an old Girl Scout round that goes, rise up, O flame, by thy light glowing, show to us vision, beauty, and joy. So that idea of the fire being telling a story I think is out there.
Sarah?
I just want, just after this paragraph, he tells Nell, and knowing you is adding a chapter to my story,
Yeah,
which is very important. It tells us how he builds a story. So it's built on real events. And then the memory is what he sees is the flames.
thank you. David?
Several things. This scene reminds me of Lizzie Hexam and Our Mutual Friend, who sees pictures in the fire.
Right.
The canal that the bargemen are on, the canals were the first great improvement in transportation in England at this point. You could carry an immensely heavy freight by water with one horse pulling it. This is before the railroads and before the roads began to be improved. Third thing, a neurologist that I know says that he believes, after his research, that the human brain is hardwired for stories. That's how we think, is we make stories out of impressions that we receive.
Very good. I wanted to allude to what John was talking about, on the barge, that Nell is vulnerable. And it just made me think, I believe it's in Evelina. I know it's a novel by Fanny Burney. The heroine goes to a public gathering of some kind, like, some assembly at Bath, something of that nature. And she is separated from her male protector. And as she walks out to get in her carriage or wherever she's going, she's set upon by some young, playboy rich guys, and nothing bad happens. But the author wants us to know that anytime a woman is in public without a male protector, she is potentially vulnerable. And that's what makes these narratives of women wandering so emotionally powerful, I think, because there is such risk involved. Alice?
Thank you, Sarah, for your comment about the following paragraph with regard to Nell. And I think and I think this was at a Dickens universe several years ago when they talked about the process of transactive memory, and that idea that story not only lives inside of us, but our story lives inside of others. And so when Nell eventually dies, and we see that at the end, my edition is the older penguin, so it's at the end, but they're all recalling. There's this scene, like one called to mind how he had seen her sitting on the very spot and how her book had fallen on her lap. And another told, and it continues, another said this, another said that. So in the quote that you chose, Glenna, I think it's really, and I think it's a very thoughtful quote. I'm thinking of what Sarah said and even what David said. Story not only is what we create in our own mind, but it's what we help to create in the mind of others.
Well, if I may be a little bit autobiographical along the lines of the power of narrative, the job market sent me from the Bay Area, from Stanford to Oklahoma, where I knew no one. And my refuge was 19th century novels. And it's because the power of those narratives created such an alternative universe. This is when I began to reread some, almost obsessively, my favorite novels from the Victorian era, because they were so capacious. You could lose yourself in those narratives, and you were not in a backwater town in rural Oklahoma. you were, you know, on the moors of Yorkshire or wherever. Any other comments? And John, do you have anything more? I still love your interjections. Do you have
One,
anything to say?
one other thing that Nell and the steelworker have in common is that the steelworker, like Nell, has no mother. And part of his gazing into the fire and finding stories there is the memory of something lost. And Nell also later on finds comfort from the fire later in this section. But fire gazing is always in Dickens, or frequently, like Lizzie Hexam, a figure for the imagination and for the sustaining power of story and of fancy and of fairy tale, to refer back to the illustration that you showed.
And Kathy?
You know, when you bring up stories, it makes me think of Joseph Campbell, that stories are repetitive and, you know, and we keep telling them. And they're very powerful. Obviously, everybody said that, but it really reminded me of Campbell.
Any other comments before we move on? Well, in the next chapter, we see Nell and, you know, the feet hurting, but she is really failing. She is really weak. One wonders how much longer she's going to be able to go on. And then, truly like a Deus Ex Machina, they encounter the schoolmaster. And how should I put it? This whole encounter and its follow-up, its consequences, when she's in such a bad way, and then they encounter the schoolmaster, one wants it to be, oh, now everything's going to be okay. But we find out that she's still struggling. And so I think this is an interesting narrative device, that on the one hand she's rescued, but then the final few chapters we read, she's hardly flourishing. Does anyone have any reactions to that?
We should at least mention and look at the illustration that accompanies it, the crowd of unemployed workers who are marching as a group. And this is almost certainly a reference to the early development of the Chartist movement, working class political movement of protest and demand for greater participation in the franchise. And for me, that raises a question about what the politics of this novel are. Does it have a politics? I mean, if we can certainly focus on the stories that are being told, but does it have a larger social dimension?
Well, that's a wonderful question. I was intending to use a passage that directly addresses that. So before we move on to that passage and more discussion about the politics of the novel, I see that both Mary and Martha Clark have their hands up. So let's take questions and comments and then we'll move on.
Well, as we come closer to the end of this passage for this week or this time, we begin to see that Nell herself is much more aware of her own mortality. And there's a sadness, for me, that pervades a couple of these chapters. She's thinking very much of death. She's going to make a garden in the graveyard. I think maybe Dickens is getting us ready for the blow that's going to come when Nell does die. It's extremely emotional. I found it that way anyway.
Yeah, this kid spends a lot of time in cemeteries. Martha?
Actually, let's see.
Martha?
I was going to say the same thing. It's terribly sad, and you can just kind of tell things are not going to go well.
Thank you, Clark.
This is not quite related, but it's in the chapter. Speaking of the mythic imagination, this is more of a question, I suppose. Is it too much to think about the passage at the bottom of 340 and the top of 341 as a allusion to the book of Exodus, with the fire by day and the cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night? It's a bizarre, if so, it's kind of a bizarre analogy, but they are looking for I guess they are looking for Canaan in a way.
Yes, they are.
And release from captivity for sure. But is that a reasonable connection?
I'm looking, the next passage I want to use is on page 341. So I think
Good.
We'll get to that. Kathy? Kathy, did you have something you wanted to say?
I was just going to say that, it's a testimonial to what a great writer Dickens was, because, it looks like Nell is saved, but you can see that Quilp is right there, on the top of the stagecoach in all his misery, foreshadowing. I mean, really, as Nell starts to see her mortality, or we do, he's foreshadowing her death, and at the same time he's never letting any happiness remain for very long, because Quilp is coming, and something bad is going to happen, and that, and then Christopher, who that's who Quilp calls him, he's brought back into the story, and it's almost like he can take over when she dies, or his section, can go on.
Yep. Thanks. David?
When Charles II was dying, he was attended by 5 doctors. One of the disadvantages of being a monarch was you got more doctors doing things to you. He said to them at some point, "I apologize to you, gentlemen, for being such a tedious time a-dying." And I have to say, I felt in rereading this that Nell was spending rather a tedious time getting on with dying. Somebody described the plot of one of Samuel Richardson's novels as procrastinated rape, and this is procrastinated death.
Well, we're not going to be cynical about this, remember? Sarah?
You're muted.
I felt that the 4-5 chapters are a very deep meditation on dying, and especially dying young. So I marked so many quotes. So I read two to you that are amazing. When the schoolmaster shows her the room that she'll use, she said, a quiet, happy place, a place to live and learn to die in. And the schoolmaster replies to her, a place to live and learn to live and gather health of mind and body in. So there are so like the entire chapters are just such a meditation on life and death.
Yep. Pat?
Yes, I have to apologize to all of you Dickens fans because this section really bothered me. I agree with David. You know what? You sometimes read that Dickens was paid by the word. I apologize wholeheartedly, but it is really he seems to me to be taking up space to prepare for the demise of Nell. But of course, we all know that there were people waiting to see if Nell lived or died because that's historical knowledge, I guess, in the US or something. They were waiting for the part where she died. But this section, much of it really I'm a lay reader, and the section really bothered me that it was too drawn out. I'm sorry, David, you said it so much more graciously than me.
Well, I hear you. It reminds me of when I was a little girl, my father took me to see Aida, and the final scene where they're in the grave dying. It's like, please, please, die, die. Oh boy. Kathy?
Well, I agree with I guess it's Pat that and well everyone's saying. I mean, Dickens, he was making money. He making money by the word. And he, enthralled his readers and got more people to buy the books, obviously, by having this long drawn up, as Pat talked about. I mean, all the people coming to the boat to buy in the United States to buy this book to find out about Nell. And it's the main thing, if people didn't just study this story, as all of you do, if you think about this book, it's the one thing you know about, the death of Nell. So the death of Nell, in his, writer's point of view, needed to be dramatic, drawn out, have a lot more words than you like, but it didn't matter. It made him more famous. And really, I just think that the counterpoint that he kept going back, she's going to die, she's not going to die, and she's the main character, was good writing. Sorry to take the obvious other point.
Well, if I may weigh in before I call on more people, I personally think that he's still learning his craft with this. For me, the most moving death of a child in all of Dickens is the death of Paul Dombey. And that is foreshadowed, but it's foreshadowed so poetically. And it strikes me as somber, but so beautiful. And this is like, oh my gosh, this child is going to another cemetery. So I do hear what you guys are saying. David.
We know that Dickens's contemporaries were greatly moved by this. Of course, they'd seen more children die than we have. I tried when I was younger to come up with a satisfactory definition of sentimentality. And I'm wondering whether John or you, Glenna, or anyone else has one to offer.
I am not a literary scholar. I will say that one of my favorite books is by a literary scholar. And John, do you know the book Sensational Designs by Jane Tompkins?
No, don't know it.
I
know who Jane Tompkins is, but I don't know that particular book.
Well, she talks about American fiction.
Yeah.
And she talks about Uncle Tom's Cabin specifically. She talks about the women's literature that was deemed sentimental. And so for me, I'm going back to politics, which we'll get to before too much longer. This is a very gendered word as it's been applied. When a way of ignoring a lot of fiction written by women was to label it as sentimental, and then it doesn't really belong in the canon. And the point of Jane Tompkins' book, Sensational Designs, is she talks about the young orphan girls struggling and what they had at their disposal. This is a narrative theme in a lot of the fiction by women in the antebellum period, which was greatly beloved. And then she talks about Huck and Tom and their escapades. And she says, you know, what they're up to might be amusing, but it has no relationship to reality. It's, you know, two little boys doing the things that they're doing ain't gonna happen. And so that's why I'm very hesitant to define the word, except to say that it has been used as a cudgel against women writers. Karen?
Yeah, I am thinking of the book by Valerie Purton on sentimentality in Dickens. I would have to run into the other room and get the actual title, but she's an advocate for his sentimentality. Being a sentimentalist myself, you know, even Goethe's Young Werther is not too much for me. So I will couch my comment within that context. I think we have to give Dickens credit here for being genuine. Forget the word count. In 1937, you will remember Mary Hogarth, age 17, died in his arms. This novel is written in 1840. I've done a lot of study of grief in my profession, and I just think he is having a catharsis here. He is working through some of his own grief related to Mary. And the later criticism just leaves me cold. I think we need to take this for what it is. Dickens, in his most honest way, working through some of his own grief. And yes, it's maybe over the top for those of us who grieve differently, but it doesn't strike me at all as contrived. Yes, this is a book of repetition. He goes over and over and over things, but don't we do that with grief? So my comment.
Really, and this is a very interesting discussion. Bill?
I was struck while reading this section about, knowing from earlier discussions and just common knowledge that little Nell dies, that this seems to be the section where that becomes evident. Up until now, we've, even in the discussions, we haven't brought up that particular point. Does she die in the end? It's like, oh, we can't talk about that. That's giving away the story. But at this point, during this last journey, it's where it becomes obvious that, she has expended all of her strength and, she's sort of doomed. And the dynamic between her and her grandfather changes. It's no longer her looking after him, but he starts looking after her on the carriage ride up north, right? She's the one in the carriage, and somehow he's managing to walk along the side of the carter for, days on end. So the idea that she takes a long time to die, yes, I agree with, but sorry, as someone has said, Dickens is doing a slow build here, right? That he is building the tension because while we all know how this is going to turn out, at the time nobody did, and obviously at the time this was, from a literary standpoint, extremely effective.
Very good. Kathy, and then we'll move on to the next
I'm going to
section.
say this really fast. I'm going to kind of switch sides on myself. I teach aging, and the history of death. I mean, we all know that people died left and right around these people. They could smell death. They knew death. They knew it intimately. We reading it right now are a whole group of people who, are all of our parents or grandparents were put into nursing homes on a routine basis. You did not do death. People didn't die at home, didn't die in the streets yet. And so I think a lot of reaction comes from, you know, he was writing to, you know, a whole audience that knew death intimately, and he could draw it out, and people wanted to read about it. Where we look at it, I'm not saying it's all bad about you, but in general, we are not a group of people, especially in the United States, that knew death at all. We're learning better, but we didn't know it. We stuck
Clark?
people away.
Thank you, Clark.
I just last year, Tricia Luton's retired professor at University of Georgia visited my class. We were doing Tale of Two Cities, and sentimentality came up in the story and the discussion, and she explained this, I thought, in kind of a helpful way. She said there is such a thing as unearned sentimentality and earned sentimentality, and that she argued that with Dickens, there's always a sense that you've gotten to the point where there is more sentiment than you might think of as necessary or appropriate, but he's gotten to the point where he wants to give it that attention. I thought it was a generous comment from her about what Dickens does from time to time.
I like that. Thank you. Caitlin, and then we should move on.
Thanks, Glenna. By the way, this is my first time reading this novel. I did not know whether Nell would live or die. Almost every page, I'm hoping everything will turn out fine. So I'm really glad that we haven't talked about her death until now, because now it seems certain. I want to confess that other than the pity I feel for her life being cut short, I am still so angry at her grandfather. He is the cause of this.
Yeah.
And it really flared in me when she woke up terrified at night with a stranger in her room next to her bed, and he was stealing the gold coin out of the hem of her dress. I try to talk myself out of this reaction by reminding myself that gambling addiction is a disease, and that's like blaming a person who's ill for his or her behavior. But he has dislocated this young girl from what was a relatively safe environment because of her young admirer. He's dislocated her from what might have been an inheritance. She is the initiator of trying to save the two of them together as they walk out into the unknown lands, both as vulnerable as can be, a young girl and a feeble old man. And he has not changed his addiction. And in fact, the kind of final danger that he really imposes on her is when he's about to steal from their benefactor in order to play cards with these jerks. I mean, does no one else feel, I as pitiful as Nell's situation is, my anger actually overcomes my feeling of pity for her. My confession.
Okay. Well, let's move on to the next slide. It's a quite long passage.
Can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Is this the right?
Yeah. Okay, so this is from page 341. And this is, we're still in the steel mill, or in Birmingham. Does anyone want to read it? If not, I guess I can volunteer. But nighttime in this dreadful spot, night when the smoke was changed to fire, when every chimney spirited up its flame, in places that had been dark vaults all day, now shone red hot with figures moving to and fro within their blazing jaws and calling to one another with hoarse cries. Night, when the noise of every strange machine was aggravated by the darkness, when the people near them looked wilder and more savage, when bands of unemployed laborers paraded the roads or clustered by torchlight round their leaders, who told them in stern language of their wrongs and urged them on to frightful cries and threats, when maddened men, armed with sword and firebrand, spurning the tears and prayers of women who would restrain them, rushed forth on errands of terror and destruction to work no ruin half so surely as their own. Night, when carts came rumbling by, filled with rude coffins. The carts rumbling by reminds me of A Tale of Two Cities, by the by, filled with rude coffins, for contagious disease and death had been busy with the living crops, when orphans cried and distracted women shrieked and followed in their wake. Night, when some called for bread and some for drink to drown their cares, and some with tears and some with staggering feet, and some with bloodshot eyes went brooding home. Night, which unlike the night that heaven sends on earth, brought with it no peace, nor quiet, nor signs of blessed sleep. Who shall tell the terrors of the night to the young wandering child? So, this is a passage that I think most grammatically presents the issue that John had earlier raised, that is, what are Dickens' politics in this book? But there's other things to be said about this passage too. Who would like to comment? In some ways, I'll say, for starters, and then for Peter, this reminds me a bit of passages in Barnaby Rudge, which we read at the Universe a few years ago, where Dickens conveys the terrible injustice that's visited on poor people, but then he, in the executions, a woman who's being executed with a baby at her breast and so on, and yet the horror of the mob in action. And this has the same tenor where, the sufferings are horrible, but what is the political solution that's going to improve things? Is it really terror in the night by the oppressed? Peter. Peter, you want to unmute yourself?
It struck me as another case of like Barnaby Rudge, where Dickens just has this terrible horror of the mob, and people, being morally degenerate, morally and psychologically degenerating to violent savages, which is kind of part and parcel of a kind of moralism in Dickens. It's like he doesn't have a politics, like it's like there's a more he wants moral reform as opposed to political reform. He doesn't have a big picture of, of course, this is the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and it's like who's gonna figure the Industrial Revolution out anyway at this particular time. But it struck me too. I recently read North and South, and I guess who's the character? Elizabeth the Gaskell has the same sort of reaction. It's like she has a working class character, and it's like he's an extremely moral character, and he's in a union, but then she has a mob actually. So there's, I was kind of disappointed in the novel because there's no, the union doesn't actually accomplish anything. It's like it turns into a mob, and the strike fails, and then we're left with the sole individual working man character becoming sort of a moral paragon, and everybody's supposed to be look towards him as a figure of moral reform as to, let's say, actual political or social change or something. So it's kind of like Dickens getting stuck in his period. He's not going to support union activities because he's afraid, that unions are going to turn into mobs. And I don't know. So it's one of those cases where Dickens doesn't go where I want him to go, but And it may be something that's endemic to the Victorian period and the Industrial Revolution, when people are trying to figure out whether or not they can solve these kinds of problems in them. They don't have a solution. I'm going on and on, but it's kind of like it's like basically it's Dick Barnaby Rudge again, where the Union, instead of becoming a political force, for change, actually degenerates into a mob.
All righty, let's hear from Wayne.
Thank you. Yes, I think Dickens had read Carlyle's warning about Chartism from 1837. I think Carlyle had made the point that unless there was more reform, some reform in the voting system, there would be a violent revolution. And in this wonderful passage, I can't help but think sometimes of my experience playing the organ. So, because what Dickens is doing is pulling up one stop after another, building up the volume here. And to me, it's the other side of his sentimentality. I just really feel Dickens felt you have to get at people emotionally, and then maybe they'll go somewhere else. But without that strong emotional pull, you're nowhere.
Well, I think you've touched on something really important, is the rhetoric. The rhetoric that's employed here is when he has a particular heightened effect he's trying to achieve. He switches into I don't know exactly what I would call it, but it's a different rhetorical mode than just ordinary narration.
True.
Kathy? Kathy, you're muted.
Glenna?
Okay, I got
it. The screen has lost the the part that was written, but I'm always astounded again by Dickens' brilliance with words, where he talks about he doesn't just say people were dying. He says filled rude coffins, which is a great description, for contagious disease and death had been busy with the living crops. I mean, and then the result, orphans, they lost their parents, distracted women. I mean, the brilliance of his writing just keeps repeating.
It's a stunning passage.
Stunning. It really is. Thank you.
Kathy, are you ready to hold forth?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I agree with Wayne, as I said, and I think he is very, very aware of the Industrial Revolution here. And, unemployed people, you don't know whether they're in the union or not in the union, but I mean, people, as Barnaby Rudge, illustrates, were incredibly, living this horrible nightmare through the Industrial Revolution. And I think he is describing the horror of it all, the horror to human beings and the workers that were either out of work or usually overworked to their deaths. And I don't see him losing it at all here in this. I think it's one of his great points in every single novel that he writes, is that he is really, a very timeless writer describing what really happened there. He's true, and I agree with him.
Great. David?
Peter seemed to me, as he often does, to have hit the nail on the head. I can't think of any novel I've read from the 19th century in which the Union people are the good guys. There are a number in which they're villains. Charles Reade's Put Yourself in His Place is one example. If anyone knows one where the Union is presented sympathetically, I'd like to know of it.
Okay. Bill?
Another consideration, though, is that we're less than 50 years from the end of the Napoleonic revolutions in France. So the idea of the mob rising up, overthrowing government, and plunging the world into chaos was not at all foreign to Dickens' world. The French had had at least 3 big revolutions in the early 19th century as well. So the idea that, at any point society could collapse around us was not actually wholly unrealistic, given what was going on the next country over.
Yes.
A good point, and I just wanted, to point out, when you think about it, this is the brilliance of our civil rights movement, that somehow or other, the leadership of Dr. King and others managed to mobilize huge numbers of people and keep them nonviolent, and they were very effective. But what's the movie that came out last year about Bayard Rustin with and it showed all the organizing that went into the March on Washington. It's just an incredible primer in what goes into mobilizing thousands of people and seeing to it that there's no stone is unturned in trying to keep it nonviolent and peaceful so that it will attract adherents. But thank you. Mary?
Well, obviously, what Bill said about France, the French Revolution, Dickens depicted it in the Tale of Two Cities. I think it's hard to look at this beautiful passage and say that Dickens was paid by the word for this. I don't think there are any unnecessary words in that passage. I think it's amazing. And he often in his novels uses this type of repetition, which I find very effective. And if you look at it carefully, it's actually all one sentence. Would you like to have to diagram it? That's all.
Thank you. John, could I ask you to weigh in on what you think the politics of this passage might be?
Well, I think Dickens is very sympathetic to the sufferings of the poor. And that if we think about the way in which social class is represented in the novel, there's Miss Monflathers, who runs the school for young ladies, polite, upper class finishing school, we might say. And if we think about the doctor who takes care of Nell in the inn, and on the one hand, there's the landlady who gives her tea and rest, and the doctor says, "Oh, I prescribe tea and rest," and then takes credit for the positive benefit of his prescription. That Dickens's sympathy is very much with the humble people in the novel. And even though grandfather is a shopkeeper, we could say he's a lower middle class person. Nell and grandfather have dropped out of the class system. They're homeless people. They're unhoused, and they are wandering around England with no particular destination in mind, just dependent on the kindness of other humble people, and occasionally of people who are maybe a little bit better off. I mean, the schoolmaster is better educated, obviously, and he acquires in this section of the novel, he acquires a job because he's lost his job at the previous school where he was employed, and he comes to a place where he has shelter that he can share with them. But at that point, he's basically between jobs. I mean, he's not an upper class figure. So Dickens's sympathy is with the humble and with the poor. And I think that I forget whether it was David or Peter, or in some way both of them commented on the fact that Dickens's politics of anger and fear are related to, or perhaps the other side of his sentimentality. That sentimentality is one reaction to suffering, and anger and fear are another reaction to suffering and injustice. And Dickens doesn't propose a political solution. He doesn't have a political ideology beyond sympathy. And sympathy is the core meaning of sentiment or sentimentality. I mean, David asked about a definition of sentimentality, and it's only in the 20th century, really, that sentiment becomes a pejorative term. In the 18th century and into the 19th century, sentiment was fellow feeling. The word sympathy means together, pathy, feeling. It's the basis of compassion. Compassion is perhaps a similar word to sympathy. And so Dickens's politics are based in compassion. They're based in sympathy. And Fred Kaplan, who wrote a biography of Dickens, wrote another book that's less well known than his biography of Dickens, called Sacred Tears. And money is not money. Money is what motivates Quilp. Money is what motivates many of the upper class people and the middle class people. But the poor have only a penny to give, like the man in the steel mill. What he has to offer is compassion and sympathy and fellow feeling with Nell and with grandfather. And I think that Dickens's politics don't take an ideological form, or he's not a supporter of unions. And he recognizes that people need to come together and care for each other. I mean, it's a form of love, but a form that is of a higher dimension than personal love. And one way in which it manifests in this novel is with all the people who come to visit Nell, as it becomes increasingly evident that her health is in decline. And it's as if she, in a religious sense, Nell is on her way to becoming an angel. And people recognize that she's a kind of mediator between this world and the next. She's of a higher order. Grandfather at one point in this section says she'll be a woman soon, and we know better. We know she's not going to make it. Is her age 13 or is it 14? I forget what we're told early in the book, but this is not a Bildungsroman. I think Nell does grow in strength and acquire greater agency. She's the one who plans the escape from the card sharps when they are trying to get grandfather to steal from Mrs. Jarley. She does have greater strength. My favorite indication of her greater strength is that grandfather, when they first get to to Birmingham, to the city, before they get to the steel mill, and grandfather says to Nell, "Why did you bring me to this place?" And she turns to him and says, "Hey, I have suffering too. You're not the only one who suffers." And I really like Nell's talking back to grandfather at that point, because it indicates that she does have self-awareness, that she has a strength that grandfather does not have. So I'm wandering a little bit from the question of politics, but I think Dickens's politics are based in sympathy. They're based in compassion. They're based in fellow feeling.
I wanted to say, I mean, I'm so struck by what you're saying. One reason that I read Sensational Designs is that I have argued in things I've written about American women's history that that the novel gave women power in the public sphere when they didn't have the vote, when they didn't control property in their own name necessarily. And so, you know, when Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, which had an immense impact on public opinion, she couldn't vote. She couldn't run for office. She couldn't do any number of things that would have been political actions, but she could write a novel that would engage the feelings of people, and they would begin to see why slavery was so wrong when it has seemed a remote, you know, oh gosh, it's too bad, but it's not uppermost in my mind. And she put it on the agenda, and it was because of the capacity to arouse feelings. So there's another reason I think that sentimentality, quote unquote, is such a gendered concept, because the capacity to write books that move human emotion is so important to women. And one other quote I want to throw in before, there's a book, again, I've used American letters a lot to in my writing about American women's history. There's a book by a late scholar of American literature, J. Fliegelman. It's called Prodigals and Pilgrims, and it's about the Revolutionary period. And he talks about John Adams, you know, founding father, wrote, I forget whether it was to Abigail or somebody, he wrote, "The people are become Clarissa. Clarissa rebels against her parents because they're trying to force her into a marriage." This is, you know, Samuel Richardson's novel, Clarissa Harlow. Clarissa rebels against her parents, and Richardson engaged the feelings of readers about the injustice of this, you know, parents trying to force the heroine into marrying somebody that she disapproves of and doesn't love. And John Adams, in writing about the American spirit of rebellion against King George, he says the people have become Clarissa. And I think that's a really good quote in showing how, you know, how novels did have a political weight in many ways, not necessarily one that the author had in mind. Uncle Tom's Cabin, Harriet Beecher Stowe absolutely had a political goal in mind. I doubt that Richardson did, but his novel was used that way in talking about throwing off patriarchal rule. Catherine.
I was just thinking in the discussion about how Dickens felt about the poor, the abused, the exploited, how much is based on his own experiences in the blacking factory. And thinking about the effect on him as a child, I guess one of my thoughts on the sentimentality part of it is, to me, Nell seems too perfect given what she's gone through. It's hard to imagine a child living through what she's lived through, continuing to be so supportive of her grandfather and so on. As you pointed out, there was that one place where she answers him back, but I don't know, to me, she seems almost too angelic given what she has experienced. And as long as I have your attention, one question, I don't know if we'll get to this about Quilp, but something I have wondered in rereading this book is, at that time when it came out, were there objections from people who had children who were born with dwarfism? I would imagine that in the streets of London or in any city at that time, one would have seen on streets many children with handicaps, children who were born with, you know, serious physical or mental problems, and whether people would have found Quilp too evil with the evil somehow linked to his dwarfism?
That's a really good question. I don't know the answer, but I will say that in my lifetime, I've seen, it was completely normal to say, or, any number of physical conditions that we now treat with empathy. When I was a kid, I mean, oh, that, etc. So I suspect that it was not that big a deal, but I can't say for sure. Kathy, did you have some? And then we want to move on to talk about Quilp.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So I sort of disagree about Dickens not being political. If you go to and I'm sure many of you have been there, to the museum in London about Dickens, there's a whole room about him being the first investigative reporter, which he is. He was a journalist, and he was a satirical reporter in many, many ways, but it wouldn't be the politics that we know. I mean, I know, you can't format it that way, but we know so much, I mean, about what happened in reality from Dickens, from reading him, and also people who lived in that time. It was he was the first person to really write about, I mean, you're allowed to write, I think he was one of the first people to really write about the poor and what was really happening to them. So I see him in a very, very different way.
Okay, Wayne?
Thanks. Just a quick note about dwarfism. If I'm not mistaken, Mrs. Moucher in David Copperfield is a dwarf. And she recognized herself, maybe John can correct me, but she recognized herself and complained to Dickens. So
yes, that's right.
When he brought her back in the narrative, he sort of made her a nicer character. But I don't know of anybody who claimed about Quilp.
David?
I don't know anyone who complained about Quilp. I think he's very much representative of the stage tradition, that deformity of some sort reflects moral deformity. Richard III, for example, but there are a number of stage villains who are physically abnormal.
Yeah.
Some Kathleen points out people were going to freak shows. Yeah. Let's move on to the next image. Ava? Yeah, great. Okay, so here we have, just as John was earlier discussing, Quilp is spying on the family. Everybody thinks he's dead because he's gone missing. And there's so many things about this picture I find interesting. Everyone is so grotesque except Mrs. Quilp. She's depicted along the lines of the way little Nell is depicted, as a woman of refinement, of gentility. That's one thing that strikes me. It's certainly a depiction of malevolence on the part of Quilp. Everybody else, the Samson Brass is a buffoon. Mrs. Quilp's mother is not exactly a picture of feminine grace. So what comments do people have about, of course, now we're in the passage where Quilp goes missing and then he shows up and he's angry at everybody. And his poor wife is actually has been grieving, but he's still angry at her, just on general principle, I take it. And we see him, this whole series of chapters, since we don't have infinite amount of time left. This whole series of chapters shows us Quilp plotting. We know that he's up to no good. We don't yet know exactly the form his being up to no good is going to take. But so comments about this picture and about the passage would be very welcome. I mean, the passage, I mean this section of the book dealing with Quilp. Why do you think, I don't know the answer, why did the illustrator depict Mrs. Quilp as a person of gentility and everybody else in her social circle is grotesque? John, do you have any insight into that?
Well, Mrs. Quilp is someone who is oppressed within her domestic circle, and Nell is someone who's oppressed by Quilp also outside the domestic circle. So I think she's a figure in this illustration for Nell, or for a type of person like Nell. Not exactly identical, but the only character who seems to have the capacity for genuine feeling. I mean, Samson Brass, as soon as Quilp makes his appearance in this scene, as not dead, immediately begins to kiss up to Quilp, because he's always obedient and a sycophant to Quilp. And so the other characters in this are grotesques, Samson Brass in particular, and the two characters on the right are the workmen who've been dragging the river for Quilp's body. And Quilp says, don't expect a tip from me for your labor.
I see Mary has her hand up.
Well, I'm not exactly answering your question, but I've throughout this work, I have wondered how Mr. and Mrs. Quilp ever got together. I just, I can't fathom this. And then why her mother is depicted in such a grotesque way, I'm not quite sure of that either. I guess Quilp would see her that way. He certainly is not fond of her, to say the least. But how they got together is a mystery to me.
Sarah?
I just want to ask if this picture is similar to the one that John described, that Nell is not in the picture, but she's the one who's seeing what's happening. Same is here, because Quilp is hiding, and he looks at what is happening through a slice of window or something. So this again is a picture from the point of view of Quilp.
Yes, but Quilp is in this picture, and Nell isn't in the first one.
Oh, Quilp is here? No, where do we see Quilp?
Oh, on the left, peeking out of the door.
Yeah, peeking. Oh, okay. So, interesting.
There is the suggestion that Quilp has some kind of demonic sex appeal. That he's a fascinating character who attracts revulsion and interest as well.
And fascination.
Yeah.
But it's also the case that, I mean, as far as why this seemingly lovely woman would be married to an ogre, it's also the case that sometimes economic circumstances forced women into marriages, or their families. You know, Mrs. Ginwin could have said, "I'm not supporting you," and then, you know, now Mrs. Ginwin has a domicile as well as her daughter, so you know that was something that happened in the real world too. Kathy?
Yeah, I think I agree with you that, you know, I mean, Quilp seems to be I'm not really sure, but it seems to me that he has money and obviously taken it, you know, in an avarice way, but you know, maybe that attracted, I mean, she is too pretty to like in a normal way be attracted to him, but perhaps, you know, as in the times that, you know, she married him for his money, or she has money and he married her. Because that seemed to be, you know, why, you know, it was sort of this transactive thing in marriage at that point that you know,
Well,
you got
I don't think
land, you got money.
I don't think it's, I'm not suggesting she married him for his money. I'm suggesting she married him because she didn't have many other options.
Well, she's pretty, she's very pretty to not have options.
Well, somebody put in the chat that Richard III had sex appeal too. So I thought that was a good point. Well, we're getting close to the end, so, and I did want to spend a little time talking about the last section. So does anybody have anything else that they want to say about Quilp and this passage?
Quilp enjoys practical jokes, and the fact that he's presumed dead but is not and can make a dramatic reappearance appeals to his slightly sadistic sense of humor.
I wouldn't use slightly.
More than slightly.
Yeah. Okay, let's move on to the last slide. And again, I thought this was, you know, this is the refuge from the storms of life for Nell and her grandfather, as provided by the kindly schoolmaster. And I don't know, this looks a little to me like the crypt in Edward Drood. It doesn't seem like cozy domesticity. It's a shelter, and they haven't had one. It's stability, and they haven't had it. But in keeping with what others have said about her death being relentlessly foreshadowed, this image, it seems to me, is quite striking along those lines. And I'm interested in other people's opinions.
It's referred to as an old and ghastly place somewhere.
And yet Nell is looking over in the direction, and she's fascinated by this place from a distance. There's something that attracts her in a favorable way. But I think this illustration is quite creepy. And you don't have to, not only this image, but this last section where, again, as I say, she's spending time in the cemetery, and people try and cheer her up, and she says something about a place to learn to die. Any comments about this last segment as well as this image?
I'll say a couple of things. Glenna, I think she is learning to die in this scene, in this image, in this passage, that she's drawn to graves. She's drawn to tombstones. She's in some sense returning to the shop, the opening shop, where there's the picture of Nell asleep, surrounded by all the grotesque objects in the curiosity shop. It ties together the beginning and the end of the novel, giving it a more religious context, not just a collection of grotesque, curious objects, but religious icons. And Nell increasingly becomes that angelic figure, and the mode of the book is hovering between allegory and realism.
Okay, Kathy and then Pat.
I don't have anything to say.
Okay, Pat.
Sure. To me, it looks like what could be the inside of a mausoleum. I'm sorry, but this is the preparation for what's to come, I guess, and to me, that's what it looks like. So, okay.
Okay, David.
I'll mention again Pilgrim's Progress. Nell's journey is to death. There's an allegorical element. She and her grandfather have no destination other than death.
I'd like to ask a question. Where are they supposed to be in England at this point in time? Is it ever said?
They see the Welsh mountains.
They're in the west of England, and scholars have identified the name of the town that is supposed to be the original for this, but I forget what it is. But the west is a kind of destination because the west is where the sun sets, and the setting of the sun is always or frequently in religious poetry a figure for decline and death. David, who's the poet, the 17th century
John
poet?
Donne.
Yeah, it's Donne who writes Stepping Westward.
Yeah.
Well, the one I'm thinking of, when John Donne writes about death, he's on his deathbed and he writes, "This is my Southwest discovery."
So the idea of heading west is part of the allegorical structure of the book.
Peter.
Yeah, I was thinking, all that picture looks awfully Gothic, and the cabinets are made, for monks cells, and it's almost as if Dickens, because he can't represent them ending up in some kind of idyllic pastoral, environment because she's going to die. He's sort of grabbing for some, some morbid, images, and where do you grab them from? You grab them from the Gothic. So it's like there's a lot of Gothic conventions in that in the preparation for Nell's death. It just struck me as the reason the Gothic is there is because it can't be a paradise. We're not going to paradise or anything. Or paradise, we are. Nell is going there literally, but it's outside of the novel, It's somewhere else. It's some transcendent realm, but so it's like the Gothic is just sort of like a grab bag of conventions for morbidity and decay and such like.
Thank you. Sarah?
So I just want to mention that I think the next day they are fixing the place and they are working on the place and fixing. And what came to my mind, she couldn't afford to die as long as she had to take care of her grandfather. But now she knows he has a home and somebody will take care of him. So she is more accepting of her own death. So everything that you said about this place for her associated with death, but right after they're fixing it because she wants a nice place for her grandfather.
Wonderful points. Barbara?
I just want to point out that in addition to, what we're going to do with Nell at the end, what possibly could Dickens have done with the end of this novel other than this? I mean, is that plot of Quilp grabbing her plausible? Is her marrying Swiveller or something like that plausible? Is grandfather going to have a moment of epiphany and change his ways? It's just, we've been on this path. I mean, the arc of this story, it has no other plausible ending.
May I say, this is Caitlin. I pinned my hopes on the unmarried gentleman.
Oh dear.
But again, I have this is my first time reading the novel. I'm staying faithful to the discussion as we proceed. So,
well, good for you. Ginny?
Yes, I was going to say, the last picture in this section is where they're looking down the hole, the well, and
Right.
talking
Yeah.
about death. And yet it ends with Nell saying, birds will sing in the spring and it will be a happy and wonderful time. And she's still in that sort of optimistic. I mean, a lot of people think it's a heavy foreshadow of death, but in the last part of this chapter, she says everything will be happy in the spring. So it left me, the first time I read it, certainly thinking things are going to turn out like they always do in Dickens' novel, where the people are going to end up happy. And I don't know how she was going to end up happy, but she was going to be well taken care of and live on. And so this section, that whole discussion staring down the well hole was pretty creepy. Like sexton is like, yeah, that's death. Somebody's going to be down there. And she's like, well, let's wait and see, spring. She's like on the hope springs eternal thought, which, Dickens keeps giving us a little bit of hope as he goes along, which is what I think kept people hoping it was going to be a better ending.
Yep. Barbara?
Well, I'll just go back to what I said at the beginning, that I see a lot of conflict about romanticism in this book. And, the Shelley's poem, if winter comes, can spring be far behind? I mean, you've got this optimistic voice in the middle of this sad ending, and I see this as a echoing of the romantic ideas are still roaming around, and still are today, of course.
Bill?
I find the argument that you couldn't see a happy ending from this point onwards to be sort of difficult to support, given that this is Dickens. Unlikely endings are sort of his specialty. We call them Dickensian these days, right? Quilp could easily have actually fallen into the river, or may fall into the river in the next few chapters. The unmarried gentleman turns out to be a great uncle who leaves her a fortune. Her grandfather dies, thus, relieving her of that responsibility and leaving all of our foreshadowing about death satisfied. And she marries a school teacher. They all live happily ever after.
Works for me.
I like that ending.
Yeah. Yeah, I like happy endings. Well, I have found this to be a very interesting and spirited discussion. I'm very grateful to John for having given me this opportunity, and thank you for bearing with me when I trotted out my little historian's expertise. You were more my children have heard me launch into well, I'll tell you, there's a joke, and I fit the category very well. The joke has two jars. One is full of coins and the other is almost empty. The empty one says swear jar, and the other one is talking about history when no one asks you to. And my children have had to bear with me a great deal in that regard, and a new audience for my historical insights, such as they are, is always welcome. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you.
What's on tap for next month?
Wayne is going to be our discussion leader. And that will be the chapters that will be announced. And then we'll have one more meeting. So March and April will be the last two meetings on Curiosity Shop.